Hello viewers, welcome to this particular lecture on microbiology. In this particular lecture, I shall be discussing some aspects of aquatic ecosystem. Now why this ecosystem is important? It is important because of the fact that when the earth originated, maybe around 4.5 billion years ago, there was no water in this earth and there was no life. But actually because of the evaporation, there were different gases created which also included water vapor, and this water vapor condensed to produce water, and this water accumulated into the low-lying areas of the earth and it created the different seas, oceans, lakes, and thereby that actually will be included in water or aquatic ecosystem. So in this particular lecture I shall be discussing the different components of this aquatic ecosystem. Then I shall be discussing their classification or the different types of aquatic ecosystem, and finally I will be discussing the different threats that this aquatic ecosystem faces. So to start with, the different components of a typical aquatic ecosystem will include the abiotic components and the biotic components. The abiotic components include all the non-living inclusion, which may include the dissolved organic or inorganic matter. It will include the different gases, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. It will include the different colloids, and also it will include the different anionic salts. At the same time, these particular components will determine the pH, and thereby depending on the pH, if the water pH is 7, it will be perfect for sustaining life. But there are some organisms which will tolerate acidic pH or alkaline pH, below and above 7 respectively. A very important parameter is the dissolved oxygen, because oxygen is utilized by the living organism thriving in water, and this oxygen actually can be ranging between below 3 to above 9, and life actually cannot be sustained if the oxygen concentration is below 3 ppm, and effectively all the fish population will be sustained when the ppm is above 9. But normally if it is around 6 to 7, the microbes can actually survive and they normally will help to maintain the aquatic ecosystem. A very important parameter, particularly for seawater, is the salinity. What is that? Calcium and sodium and magnesium salts of chlorides. And you could see here that this salinity will basically decrease due to freezing, or it will increase after liquefaction. So this particular salinity of groundwater, salinity of water body, salinity of seawater is very important, particularly for those species which are non-salt tolerant or stenohaline species. And coming to the different biotic components now, the biotic components will include different groups of plant which are called producers, and these producers actually can be submerged, can be floating in the form of unicellular algae, or it can be partially submerged, or it can be perfectly on the land. So you can see an array of different types of vegetation which will be classified on the basis of the narrowness or the depth of the water body, and they will actually be also seen in the oceanic shore, which is called the continental shelf. Now when the oxygen concentration is too low, then the plant actually will have some strategy, some adaptation, and this adaptation may include the appearance of parenchyma in the root or the plant part. Okay?
Sir,
yeah.
How parenchyma helps in low oxygen tolerance in plants?
Yeah, you see, when the parenchyma is there, it will allow the plant to surface, to float, and whenever it is floating, it will get the atmospheric oxygen. This is of course a very important phenomenon. Apart from that, oxygen, if it is stored in the plant body, at any point of time that oxygen can be utilized. So you understand? Right. Now we come to the typical food chain or the typical organisms that normally survive in an aquatic ecosystem. So these are the producer, which is so important. It can be macrophytes, it can be microphytes, it can be plankton, and it is a huge group of plant on which there will be primarily this particular primary consumers who will be surviving, the small fishes, the herbivorous fishes, and there will be the carnivorous fishes which will survive on the herbivores. But of course, there are also the zooplanktons which can also survive on this plant, and there will be the bacterial decomposers or fungal decomposers which will allow the recycling of the nutrients back to the soil. So this is how the sustenance of this aquatic ecosystem is being carried out. Clear? Of course, when we consider these fishes, I told you that some of them are euryhaline which can tolerate saline water, and some of them are stenohaline, they are more suitably growing in freshwater. Now let us discuss the different types of marine or different types of ecosystem or aquatic ecosystem, where there will be two major groups, marine ecosystem and freshwater ecosystem. Marine ecosystem, you can see they can be classified into different types, and this classification is based on the location where they are. The planktonic species will actually remain on the surface, there will be the nectons which are below, and there will be the benthos which are far down. So depending upon the depth of the water body, these organisms will be growing, and this will create a specific strata or niche so that there is no competition between these organisms and they can survive in perfect harmony. Okay. Now, as we say that 71% of Earth's surface is water, and this is marine water because of all these ocean and seas, meaning Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, Arctic and Antarctic. And actually in that way 97% of the Earth's surface is water. But of course they generate only 32% of world's net primary production. Why? Because the primary production or photosynthesis is being carried out by the floating phytoplankton, and there are some areas where phytoplankton cannot grow, so that way they are low. So the rest of the primary productivity is being given by the terrestrial plants. Now coming to the different parts of a typical sea environment or marine environment. Actually these different parts include the pelagic zone or the open zone, and this open zone or the first important area can be further divided into upper part which is epipelagic, then mesopelagic, then bathypelagic and then abyssopelagic. You can very well understand this abyssopelagic is almost at the seabed, and there is further the hadopelagic which is even below that. So this particular depth of the seabed is being considered as the pelagic zone or the open sea zone, and the height is from 200 meter to 11,000 meter. So you can very well understand those organisms which can survive in hadopelagic region, they can be actually without getting any light or without getting any oxygen. So this particular depth is even taller than the Everest, right? Now broadly, if we consider this particular zone on the basis of the shoreline or the distance of the sea from the shoreline, it can be classified as intertidal zone, Narrator zone next to it, and finally the open sea or the oceanic zone. Of course, this oceanic zone can be photic zone where the light is reaching, and the aphotic zone where the light cannot reach, and there are those benthos. So coming to this oceanic zone, which is so important, you can see these different groups of organisms are there. There may be different fishes, there may be different reptiles, there may be different shark, there may be different mollusk, and also there may be different types of algae growing. So depending upon the depth of the sea water, there will be the color change in the different plant group, because all the colored light are not penetrating in that particular depth. Okay. So I was talking about this benthos or benthonic region or benthic region. This particular benthic region, you can clearly see, is following the continental shelf. What is continental shelf? The shelf actually which goes down into the sea. The upper part is photic zone and the lower part is aphotic zone, and this will include the different types of organisms, like the different corals, like the different sea urchins, or like the different starfishes, and of course there will be fishes. But basically in the benthos you will not find much which are photosynthetic organisms, because light is not penetrating at that depth. Now this is the littoral zone or intertidal zone. What does it mean? Normally this is land when there is low tide, but during high tide, when this particular water is progressing towards the land, this will be covered with water. So typically this littoral zone will have two types of plant, terrestrial plant and aquatic plant, and sometimes they can tolerate both terrestrial stress and aquatic stress because they remain partially submerged. And these are the different littoral zone individuals. You can clearly see the density of the chlorophyll gradually goes down because they cannot receive much sunlight with the depth of the sea. Now this is actually the Narrator zone. I told you Narrator zone is between the Pelagic zone and the intertidal zone. So this Narrator zone actually will also have the gradual depth of the continental shelf. So it will also include those planktonic and tectonic species. And these are the different organisms you can see, starting from coral, starting from sea urchins, starting from fishes, and there are also some algae or starfish growing. It's a typical structure which is the hydrothermal vent. As I was telling you, that hydrothermal vent is actually deep into the seabed and it has direct connection with the soft magma of the Earth's core. So very often what this gas is coming out, it comes out directly from the center of the Earth. So life here is really very difficult because it is very hot out there and it contains so many chemicals. So who are growing here? Some sulfur bacteria. And with the help of this sulfur bacteria, certain other organisms, they also grow, and which include these tube worms. So these tube worms or Riftia, they are the ideal inhabitants of this place, and they have a symbiotic association with this chemosynthetic bacteria deriving nourishment from them. So there is also a unique ecosystem that is growing only within the hydrothermal vent. Now let us discuss some unique activities brought about by certain flora and fauna of the marine ecosystem. One such flora is the brown algae or the Phaeophyceae. It is so called because of the unique golden brown pigment which is fucoxanthin, and they are growing as big trees called macrophytes, and these macrophytes actually will have leaves, will have reproductive structures, and they grow in huge number, and you can often see that this part of the ocean, like in North Atlantic, if you see from the aircraft, it will look brown. And that is the reason why, because this algae is called sargassum, this area of North Atlantic is called Sargasso Sea. Okay. Similarly, there is also a phenomenon called red tide brought about by another group of algae called the dinoflagellates, which actually belong to the group of protists. And these dinoflagellates are formed of two valves of cellulose, and they are having two flagella. One is horizontal, another one is vertical. But what is important, they produce this red tide, or their colonies are red and they grow in huge number, and sometimes they float on the sea, and that is causing this red tide. So that is also a very common visibility when we see from the height or from an aircraft. And this particular group of algae or this group of protists, they produce toxin which is actually causing shellfish poisoning. This is a very interesting group of organism which actually is called the coral reef. What is that? Actually they are a specific cnidarians, and these cnidarians have calcareous shell. They belong to Anthozoa, and this particular coral reef basically will grow on each other and will create a unique pattern. Sometimes it is in such beautiful deposition that they will create reef, like the name of Great Barrier Reef you must have heard in Australia. It is created by coral. Similarly, in Andaman and Nicobar Island there was a huge calcareous reef which was destroyed by tsunami. This group of organism is also very common. This belong to mollusca, and they are called the cephalopods, and they are having brain, unique brain, and that is why they are even intelligent than some fishes, and so they can predate upon fishes also. Clear?
So why are cephalopods so called?
Yeah, cephalo meaning head and pods meaning legs. So they have a big head and long tentacles like foot. That's why they are called cephalopods. Clear? Good. There are these starfishes, huge number of starfishes growing on the seabed. And these starfish actually, they have a unique system called water vascular system with which they can locomote, they can move, and they have a tube feet with which they move on the water body and they feed on those organisms growing on the water body. And there are a host of fishes which can be cartilaginous fish like the shark. And very important, shark cannot actually rest in a place because they do not have any swim bladder. So they need always to move around to keep their balance. And there may be huge number of sea fishes which actually is the future food when the terrestrial food will be less. Now there are certain problems associated with marine ecosystem. One important problem is overfishing. If we actually capture fish without replenishing them, there will be one day this fish resource will end up. Secondly, the problem of pollution. Marine pollution from the inland water, all those pollutants will be carried and will be deposited into the sea and they will not allow organisms to grow. Third one is global warming, so important. Because of global warming, the water current will change, and because of the change in water current, aquatic life will be modified. And it is a problem. You cannot find these days Hilsha. It is because of this change in the warming pattern or El Nino. There is always the activity, building activity. Lot of buildings are being constructed along the seashore, and that actually pollute the seashore, will kill the aquatic life. And lastly, most importantly, we carry out aquaculture, shrimp culturing, but because of shrimp culture, the other organisms which are economically not viable, they cannot grow. So where they will go? They will die. So that is another negative impact of aquaculture. And now we come to the next part, which is the freshwater ecosystem. Freshwater ecosystem actually is only 0.8%, very little that way. And this particular inhabitants is only 0.009% of the total water and 3%, only 3% of the net primary productivity. They can be classified into lotic or moving water system or riverine system, lentic or lake system, and wetlands. So important because these wetlands are actually neither terrestrial nor aquatic in nature. Now coming to the different types of lentic system. Broadly, lentic system can be pond system, it can be a normal big reservoir, but any one of them will have a specific abysmal depth which is definitely benthos. It will also have the littoral zone which is intertidal zone or just below the sublittoral zone depending upon the depth, and also the profundal zone or Narrator zone where actually it is far away from the shore. Which area is important? This area where the land is meeting the sea, and this area actually is called the riparian areas. Riparian areas actually will have effect of terrestrial community on the water body. What does it mean? It means the terrestrial plants will produce something which will allow the growth and development of the aquatic organism there. So riparian ecosystem is growing spontaneously along the water body. You don't have to maintain it. But where lies the problem? If this area is polluted, these organisms cannot grow. Or if this area is disturbed due to natural calamity. And of course you should understand, because the number of producer is more, this area photosynthetically is more productive. Okay? I was telling you that there may be different organisms and they can be classified into littoral organisms, sublittoral organisms, profundal organisms. Of course there are benthos on the bed of the water body. And on the basis of that, if they are too deep, naturally their size become gradually smaller. And usually in the middle zone, the big fishes are there. Again on the top layers, the smaller fishes and the zooplanktons will be there. Now there is a very interesting point to be noted here, which are actually modifications undertaken by this particular ecosystem, which is the lentic system or the pond system. What we see is, it is a common vision. Basically, this particular water body is a pond water body. So there will be plants growing around the surface, and these particular plants will die withered. They will be deposited on the bed. So gradually what happens? This particular pond becomes shallow. And this particular shallow region gradually will be ultimately totally closing off that water body. So once it was a water body, later it becomes a land. And this particular phenomenon is called succession. So succession from water to land is also called hydrosphere. Okay?
Sir, why is hydrosphere called so?
Yeah, I told you originally it was a water body, so it started with water. Now they have changed, the actual modification of this plantation has changed. Ultimately it became a peatland, but it started with water. So the several stages may be different, but as because it started with water, it will be called hydrosphere. Okay? There is another very interesting observation. Very often we see there are certain low-lying areas around the rivers which will create small pockets of water body. We call them vernal pool. And sometimes it so happens these vernal pools may be the potential source of fishes. You know, the villagers will catch fish and they are edible fishes because they are sweetwater water bodies. Okay?
Sir, is vernal pool a stable ecosystem?
It is not. I told you, because only during rainy season this particular ecosystem will be aquatic, will be viable for different organisms. But it becomes dry, and when it becomes dry the fishes will also be destroyed. But of course certain microbes, they do grow and they get into the soil or they get into a film and they survive that unfavorable condition. They wait for the next rainy season. But usually bigger animals, they cannot grow except for certain amphibians which can go inside the soil and they get into hibernation. Right? Good. Now we come to the flowing water ecosystem or lotic system. It is typically a river meandering into its own course. From the upper course it is coming down from the mountain, so it will be fast moving. When it is fast moving, naturally water movement will absorb more oxygen, so there will be more oxygen. So naturally this oxygen will be dissolved in water and this will support the fishes. So naturally there will be more biodiversity. But as it comes down into the lower course of the river, the land is more or less smooth, the flat land. So naturally water undulation is not there, so oxygen availability may be reduced on one side. On the other side, there may be increased BOD or COD level because of the more bacteria and algal population. There will be more chemical pollution and thereby the dissolved oxygen will go down, and that is how pollution is affecting the water body. So biodiversity may be sometimes less. Of course, again when it is going near the sea, biodiversity may increase again because of the impact of the sea water coming in. Clear? Now the third type of freshwater ecosystem is the wetland, and the wetland is basically, it is an interface between land and water. It will actually be created in any part of the sea or stream or river, and bogs, ponds, these swamps, marshes or fens are the different types of wetland. And this wetland is so important sometimes because of its unique vegetation. Like, you know, if I ask you which particular important aspect the Calcuttans should be proud, it is actually the East Calcutta wetland. Why? Because in this particular wetland we are depositing all our city waste, and that city waste is being converted by this unique bacterial population in the wetland into fish food, and that is the reason why there are so many fish berries in and around Kolkata wetland. Okay? So there are different functions of aquatic ecosystem. I told you they are recycling, they are purifying, they are preventing flood, and at the same time they are providing the residence for so many organisms, biodiversity, and at the same time they are sometimes used as a tourism industry. You know, if there is a very good landscape, if there is a very good bed, seabed or the mouth of the river, then people will go in for tourism. And sometimes, you know, coral reef is so important. The people, they are going inside the sea to see those coral reef. So that is also tourism. So that is why it is so important. But this particular aquatic ecosystem, we are not paying enough care, or you are not paying enough attention to this particular ecosystem. They are being polluted from industry, they are being polluted by oil spill, they are being polluted from pesticide, they are being polluted by different other agricultural waste, which may be as point pollution or non-point pollution, and ultimately they get into the water body and they create water pollution. And because of water pollution, the BOD and COD level goes up, and this will not sustain life. So life becomes very difficult, and when it becomes difficult, what happens is the case of this particular Lake Pontchartrain is a particular lake very close to the Gulf of Mexico, just next to this New Orleans, where you can see the population is so high. There will be some amount of effluents released into this lake, which will actually make certain areas of this lake dead. So this type of pollution has to be prevented. We have to protect our aquatic ecosystem in order to protect ourselves, because that biodiversity, if we don't maintain, ultimately the ecosystem will collapse and we cannot really protect ourselves. Clear? Thank you.